So there's been a massive explosion of data centres in the UK in recent years, and all the signs point to that growth continuing. In fact, the UK is now home to more than 520 data centres, and it's going to continue to expand too, especially with AI being such a big driver. And while many of the data centres originally built were in the southeast of England, new facilities are coming on in other parts now, in Scotland, Wales, and other parts of England. But while there's a lot of discussion about planning, energy, grid capacity, and the challenges around getting new sites built, one area that is talked about less is maintenance, repair, and operation support, MRO. And the stuff that keeps these facilities running once they're live. And that really matters because when a data center goes down, the impact can be immediate and serious. There's a risk of downtime. And if there's downtime, it could follow through with reputational damage, operational disruption, and a very real strain on already limited engineering resources. So today, we're going to look at what happens when a data center moves from construction into live operation and why that handover is such a critical moment, and also how operators, procurement teams, and suppliers can be better prepared for the demands that come once the site is live. To discuss this, we have a fantastic panel. We're joined by Navid Mayer, Executive and Board Member from the Data Centre Alliance, aka the DCA. Hi, Navid.
Hi, Ashley. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
No, great pleasure that you're with us. We've also got Phil Broughton, Business Development Procurement Leader from CIPS, another acronym, but I'm sure as probably most of you know, it stands for the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. Hi, Phil.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for getting me on board.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. And we've also got from RS Components, we've got Richard Graham, Industry Sector Manager.
Afternoon, everyone.
Hi, Richard.
Thanks for having me.
And each member of our RA team brings a different perspective on commissioning, procurement, supply resilience, and the operational realities of keeping a data centre up and running. Navid brings the operator and industry view, Phil brings the procurement and government lens, and Richard brings the supply service and uptime perspective from RS. So with that in mind, let's get on to the debate. So I want to kick off, Navid, because I think your core area of expertise is a lot around the kind of evolution of data centres. But when a new data centre moves construction into live operations, what does that transition actually look like on the ground? And why is it such a critical moment for that facility? I mean, it sounds like a handover on paper, but in practice, there's often a very real shift in risk, responsibility and pace once the site is live.
Absolutely. On paper, it looks very simple, but in reality, it can be quite a scary situation to be in. It can be an absolute chaos, to say the least. So to give you an example, picture a high pressure construction site where everyone's rushing to hit their deadline, sign off paperwork, and ultimately close the budget, which is what this is about. These are very expensive facilities. The site is handed over to the operations team, whose main goal is maintaining absolute stability and keeping the lights on the ground. It can create a real culture clash. You've got contractors, packing up their tools to leave site while the operators are, getting the engineers together to, scramble to check if the building is actually running safely. So all that is happening in a chaotic fashion and can sometimes be quite scary. This is the exact moment where construction headaches often turn into operational business risks. If you treat handover as just a date in the calendar, that's exactly what you can expect to see on a site, absolute chaos. And what you end up with is, even when the site is handed over, you inherently end up with hidden problems that may not be evident to start with, but in months to come, it's going to cost the operator a lot of money. And for the senior leadership team, a messy handover eats through their margins and balance sheets in months to come. And often it's quite tricky to recover from that without any losses.
Sure. Now, let's start to talk about MRO then. So looking back at recent projects, what is often missing or undercooked in the MRO plan at the point of handover from construction to operations? And where do those gaps show up first? And what does that tell us about how the site was prepared?
Yeah, it's a very good question. What I have seen time and again is I think what's almost always undercooked is the data and operational blueprint. Always seems to be out of joint. Things like completing maintenance schedules, asset logs, parts lists. Obviously, some of the very crucial blueprints seem to be missing right at the point when they should be completed. Operators often inherit multi-million pound high-tech facilities packed with complex machinery, but they don't have the digital playbook to really tell them how to operate the facility. So those sort of transitional periods always seem slightly disjointed, and I think they could be really improved in new facilities moving forward with some pre-planning and getting parties to work closely. I think many of the problems that I've seen is due to lack of parties working in collaboration due to time constraints. Ultimately, these gaps create immediate operational headaches in particular in year one. You get delayed preventive maintenance, you get inflated emergency repair costs that were unexpected. I've seen how frustrated customers start having arguments with builders on site, and so it's not a good position to be in. But ultimately, it creates an invisible drain on your balance sheet, which is what really it comes down to. And before you even started scaling up, you're eating through your margins.
Sure. Okay, so let's talk about MRO readiness at the handover stage. I think if I put this question to Phil first, and Navid, you can reply too. But who actually owns MRO readiness at that handover stage? Is it the contractor, the operator, the FM partner, engineering, or some procurement division? And why does this so often fall between the cracks when the facility first goes live?
That's a very good question. And I think I'll go back to a couple of things that have already been said. I mean, you asked kind of what it looks like. Navid was talking about people running around under pressure. I mean, it's an incredibly nervous moment. I mean, there's an awful lot of panic and all sorts. I mean, in your intro, you talked about it being immediate and serious. And that kind of has a knock-on effect on the way that people behave. So it's all about preparedness. I think, again, something that Navid said there was about collaboration and team and relationships. And relationships is something I think we'll come back to a lot in this conversation about the relationship between, all the parties you've mentioned. I mean, you mentioned there kind of engineering, kind of contractors, procurement, all sorts. It's about being a team. And I think it's about the relationships you have and the ability to really kind of respond when things are at a critical point. It's all that what if scenario. So I think one of the things that's kind of quite often missing, one of the things that where things fall between the cracks is there isn't that joined upness between all those different players in the team. Kind of when things go wrong, and they probably will. You switch anything on, quite often there's things that aren't quite right or aren't quite aligned or aren't quite working. If you've got a good team and conversations and relationships and collaboration, they get spotted quickly, identified, solution agreed and implemented really quickly, and you kind of smooth the bumps. I think where that's not, it drops down the crack and it's very hard to get it back out. So I think it is that collaboration. Different people will own different elements. It all depends on kind of we talk about big data center, but you see it in all sorts of different teams and situations. Where there are the disconnects or the poor relationships or lack of understanding or lack of alignment, then that's where things snap.
Sure. And just an adjacent question actually. Then, so is there anybody who's specifically kind of taking the lead, or does it feel a very, very collaborative process? Is there somebody with an Excel spreadsheet somewhere who's going, we need to do this and pushing people forward?
In my view, operationally and contractually, ultimately the operator must be held accountable. what's going on site. But as Phil quite clearly said, in reality, there are lots of silos. So you're working amongst multiple silos in a disjointed fashion. And I often think those, we could get rid of a lot of silos with some pre-planning and getting things in a more structured fashion. It all comes down to, I think the start of any data center construction is very positive. I think it's where you're now running out of time towards the end, and you got multiple silos and not clear about who should be finishing what. And also, at times, it feels like multiple parties are overlapping, all with good intentions, but it does cause a lot of delays on site, not to mention friction between different subcontractors. And I think there's a lot to be said about, ironing out all those issues. But the readiness needs to be written into the contracts from day zero, as far as I'm sort of concerned. If the operator doesn't legally require MRO readiness before signing off on the building, I think they're buying into a massive risk, and that can be a problem. And I think that really comes down to the leadership taking lead on that.
I agree completely with that, and I think you said earlier, Navid, about business impact.
Yeah.
And it needs to be taken seriously at that higher level, and that what if this happens, what if that happens, what if this goes wrong. So if you've got that understanding at a high level, top down, and you've got the understanding of the business impact, all the things that Navid listed earlier that could go wrong, that could impact your business, short, medium, and long term, then you kind of start to think about taking it a bit more seriously and make sure you've got that joined upness, and you kind of bring through a theoretical dry run and all sorts.
Absolutely right. And I think it really comes down to the leadership forcing these internal teams to work in a closer collaboration. And I think it really all comes down to the fact that the building is powered up now. If there was no power to the building, perhaps people could take a more relaxed approach. But now you have power to the facilities and the clock is ticking.
Mm-hmm.
It's an expensive exercise in a high-tech facility. And so what I've seen is people plan in certain facilities, people plan for the absolute best and they get average. And that's good. That's brilliant. Because, you're bound to hit problems. You're not talking about facilities where things are smooth sailing. And when you hit problems, less about finger pointing and more about working together to get things sorted. Because everyone wants to finish, everyone wants to submit their invoices. So you're all on the same team, but under pressure, that can be a big ask.
So Navid, it's almost like you're saying in some instances, it's not necessarily a bad thing if things do go wrong, because, things will then maybe get sorted out at that time, rather than if it just kind of is the perfect handover. Quite often problems will emerge later down the line when they might actually be more of a drain on the bottom line.
Yeah, you could, and I've often been down this road, not just in the UK, but Europe, international markets. You can put together the perfect framework and everyone will buy into that, and quite rightly. But as you progress through the project, you start facing time constraints. That's where things start going sideways. That's where one has to decide, we only have a year to go, but there's 2 years of work on paper. What do we do? It's not a good place to be. You don't want to take any shortcuts in a mission critical facility. And so it needs revisiting in a structured way. You can't just say, we're going to cut that corner and we're going to cut that corner, because ultimately that's not what the client signed up to. But I do feel that at the start of the contract, if people were going at a faster pace, they wouldn't necessarily be facing problems at the back end of it, because you're always going to get problems.
Sure.
So you want to buy yourself as much time as possible. You really want to hit the ground running with these projects. And you can only do that if everyone's on the same page.
Okay, so let's move on to talk about stocking, supplies and readiness. So again, Navid, it'd be interesting in your views then from from RS perspective what Richard has to say on this, but how should an operator decide which critical spares and consumables need to be on site from day one, and which can sit safely in the wider supply chain without increasing risk?
So I think this is ultimately the RS business model, if you like. This is how we support our customers, whether it's looking after a data center or any other piece of critical national infrastructure or manufacturing asset. Ultimately, understanding the impact of downtime or products going offline, if you like, or breaking that ultimately causes a cascade effect or something else not to work or the service not to be provided. Understanding the criticality is ultimately the point. And what is criticality? Criticality, I suppose, for me, is driven by a number of different measures. It might be looking at the level of redundancy that's ultimately baked into the thing that breaks. So if that first thing breaks, is there something else to take over from it to carry on running that service? If not, what is the ultimate impact of that asset going offline or breaking? And what's the lead time like to get the replacement product online or back into place to take over from the thing that's broken? Ultimately, looking at that criticality, measuring that criticality. And some industries do this better than others. It's coming up with a scoring matrix or mechanism that allows stocking policy for spare parts to be geared by that criticality, and also then engineer and human resource to be applied to that problem to go and fix that problem. Gearing it around those things is really important. I think when you look at the wider supply chain and the stuff that our customers are asking for from RS in this space, it's all about partnerships and testing people's capabilities. So it's not just looking at price for a product, it's looking at their availability to supply that product, the value they can create around that, whether that's be stocking it locally, stocking it on site through a managed inventory service, just having a broad range, if you like, for people to be able to pick from. Because ultimately, if you're looking after a complex facility like a data center, thinking about many people picture the white space when they think of a data center, but really the life support system sits in that grey space. It's the HVAC, it's the power, it's the water provision, if you like, to keep that thing cool, powered up, and working efficiently. There's many thousands, tens of thousands of complex assets in that space, and you can't predict which one will go wrong at any given point. So having a supplier that understands, firstly, scoring the criticality of those assets in that space is important. Having a supplier that's got a broad range to supply things quickly to predict when things might go wrong is also important. But then measuring that and managing that supply with agreed SLAs and through a proper partnership, tested response times, I suppose, is vitally important. Asking the question, what's the impact of this thing if it goes wrong within 24, 48, 72 hours? Having a supply chain and a supplier suited to be able to support you in that instance.
And David, I mean, do you think, do you want to just add to that, but also, kind of bear in mind, how well do you think data centers, in your experience, how good are they at managing?
I think it really depends on who you're asking the question. So you've got the engineering team on site who need spares to, react to failures, but also you've got the operator who is running a business. And I think this is a classic challenge of balancing cash flow against your risk. If you're talking about, I would say non-critical items, if that's the way to put it, relays, valves, filters, stuff that you can get next day and are well stocked, you don't need to spend a lot of capital on those items. However, if you're looking at any item, probably I use a transformer UPS as a good example. Anything that has a long lead time and you are likely to encounter problems in getting that piece of equipment, you need to plan ahead. And if you don't think you're going to have the parts on site in time, then you need to keep it on site. You need to keep spares on site, which obviously comes at a cost. So, but that's part of the risk management and the framework that you need to put together to determine, if tomorrow we have a transformer failure, what does that look like? Is it going to drag down the entire business? And and what do we do to address that? And so for those types of components, I would say really the only way is to have it on site from day one. There's no other. We work in facilities where there's no downtime. So, but once upon a time, operators used to stock a lot of filters and valves and all that stuff. Now, with nationwide suppliers, that's no longer required. Most suppliers can get it to you even on the same day. So that's no longer a problem. It just needs establishing a good relationship with that supplier and giving the supplier the opportunity to understand what your requirements are throughout the year so they can plan ahead. That does help suppliers dramatically. Knowing what equipment you're likely to be using, how often you're likely to procure, and so on. So it's all about minimizing. I mean, things go wrong. It's impossible for a data center facility not to encounter problems. It's a highly tuned engine. So, and like all highly tuned engines, it's bound to go sideways from time to time. But the idea is you put it back on track in the shortest possible time.
I would suggest that as these sensors are new, that the understanding of what may go wrong may be a challenge. It may be only after certain maintenance cycles have gone through that a customer gets clarity over what they might need to buy or stock on any given basis. So that we do appreciate that may be a difficult challenge as that sensor comes from construction through to being online and is operationally handed over. I think one of the ways in which RS looks to support that is through high quality data. So helping people understand what they're using and how often they're buying things to help inform that procurement policy and understanding of which spare parts I suppose they're buying and buying frequently. One of the challenges that we see within across industry is customers having a lack of data, and if people are buying on P cards or sporadically, using lots of different vendors in lots of different procurement methods, and it's not necessarily controlled, you can think about that data as it's lots of information, but it's not particularly insightful. The more that you can consolidate with suppliers that offer high quality data and management information, the more informative that data can be.
Also, transitioning from preventive maintenance to predictive maintenance has allowed many of the operators out there to collect the right type of data, I would say, because you can collect data. If you can't turn data into something meaningful, it becomes pointless. And unless you can translate it into something that everybody can use, it has no value. But with predictive maintenance now becoming more and more popular, now the operators have a chance to look for anomalies within their operations before you hit a major failure. And so communicating that with the suppliers and understanding what could potentially fail in a month from now on also goes towards planning, planning to reduce your failures.
Great. Shall we, we've already kind of touched on this next question, actually. So, Phil and Richard and Navid too, if you want to come in here. But let's start with you, Phil. But yeah, fragmented supplier lists are a real common headache in MRO. So how do operators consolidate spend and create a manageable supplier base without losing resilience, technical confidence, or flexibility? And what works best when you're trying to reduce complexity without creating new risk?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Richard kind of touched on this in his previous answer, where he was talking about what makes a good supplier. He was talking about responsiveness. He was talking about support and commitment. He was talking about capability and knowledge, and kind of how in this instance kind of RS look to support their customers. And I think, from a procurement point of view, you also want to be looking at the supplier preferencing model, how a supplier sees you. Off the back of that, if you are looking at being in the core box where a supplier sees you as a good customer, good business, long-term commitment, then that relationship, and relationship is a word that's come up repeatedly through this discussion. You can build a really strong relationship where you've got a really good, smooth, productive, sustainable, reliable supplier relationship with your supplier, and that's a great place to be. It gives you it's ease of management, much better that you have that kind of relationship rather than managing a fragmented supplier base of multiple suppliers doing bits and pieces. And again, Navid was talking about being forward looking and having good data and planning for the future and making sure, surety of supply. That's where you want to be. It's absolutely where you want to be. You do not want to be kind of in any of the other three boxes, really, where you're either being exploited, you're seen as a nuisance, or you're just there as potential for the future. You want to be in that core box working really closely. And that goes back to the earlier question about, kind of avoidance of downtime, full stop.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, Phil. I think the key word there is like leverage for me. Ultimately, if you can pull your spend with more capable suppliers, larger suppliers that can create value for you, ultimately you can leverage that spend with that supplier for better commercials, clearly, but also, and I think important in the data center sector more so than anything, you can leverage that for greater sort of service, and you can ask more. You can ask more of them if you like. Hold that supplier to account more than you can do if you're dealing with hundreds of suppliers that you might spend transactionally with through the course of the year.
Yeah.
That supplier ultimately is not going to be bought into holding. I think that Phil used a sort of that box analogy around being a core supplier to them, not a nuisance or a pain.
Well, then you're looking for the innovation, you're looking for the creativity, you're looking for market knowledge, you're looking for suggestions and constant improvements.
Yeah, it's that equation that suppliers ultimately expect value for money, and distributors are looking for money for the value they create, and ultimately the more value that you're putting their way, in terms of monetary spend, the more value they can create for you in terms of that innovation, that attention, that account management support, etc. And ultimately, in my mind, you can do that through you can consolidate without creating additional risk by looking at suppliers with broad-based capability, or ones that have like an omni-channel approach. Ultimately, it can trade with you in a variety of ways, and think about the way that you consume product, and look at offering a solution to match that process, that procurement process. If you've got stuff that you're buying on an ad hoc basis, you talked about inventory and stock before. You can't stock everything. That's why you have suppliers, because otherwise your data center would be 98% full of stock rather than the server racks that ultimately create the value. So you do need to have suppliers that can supply you product quickly. And for the stuff that you do use frequently and regularly, you're ultimately pouring time and people's energy into managing repeated spend. So looking at things like vendor managed inventory, where it sort of pushes that management and expectation of stock through to suppliers, where they're better placed to do it, is a more efficient use of engineers' time, especially in this space where there's sort of skills gaps and sort of challenges with the levels of engineers we've got in the industry. The final thing I'd say is, Phil's touched on it there about innovation. If you're dealing with broad-based suppliers, they're ultimately dealing with thousands of different suppliers themselves, the OEMs that manufacture the kit that they distribute. And I know for us at RS, we have really, really strong relationships with key OEMs in the sector, where we can be the conduit, if you like, to the innovation that they can bring to end users in the data center space.
Okay, so let's move on to talk a little bit about the downtime and its relationship with procurement. So a question again for Phil, and maybe Richard, you could come in too on this one. When organisations model the impact of unplanned outage, which costs matter most in the boardroom, and how often do those costs actually show up properly in procurement conversations? It's one thing to talk about unit price, but it's quite another to capture the wider commercial damage of downtime.
I think the costs that matter most for an unplanned outage are the unplanned costs. You can kind of plan for things, if things are likely to go wrong, there should be some planning in there, to allow, to mitigate for things going wrong. But when things go seriously wrong and the unplanned things go wrong, they're the things that really hit the bottom line. So I think, a lot of this is around storytelling, and a lot of the storytelling is about the importance of MRO, because I think MRO, tends to sort of sit at a slightly lower level than it should. So it is about kind of the storytelling that goes into the boardroom to get the commitment and the focus to make sure that you've got the resources. We're talking about data, not everybody's got the greatest data. Navi was talking about having good data. If it's not good, it's pointless. You need to have that, make sure you've got that good data. You need to have those good relationships. You need to have a good supplier base that you can rely on. So that kind of planning, I think, is really, really important. I mean, in an earlier conversation, we talked about what does a mature approach to critical spares and MRO look like? And at that point, we're talking about having a spare strategy that focuses on, rather than just a spare strategy, it's about business impact. It is about that business impact all the time. So in mature and, strategic situations, it does get talked about in procurement, where you're at that kind of higher level, but quite frequently it doesn't. And again, Navid was talking, gave plenty of examples beforehand about where things drop between the gaps and all sorts. That's where things boards get dropped. That's where there's an unplanned cost, and they're the nasty ones that really bite.
Sure. Phil, I'm curious actually, just, so from your perspective, what level of understanding do you think there is of MRO in data centers, boardrooms, but more generally across various industries? Is it getting better? Are executive members starting to understand it more, or is there still very much an education job to do?
I think it's always an education job. I think there's kind of skills, the kind of skills that are being focused on this could improve. I mean, they're always improving, but it's I'll kind of bow to Navid's sort of view in a minute in terms of him being probably closer than I am. But I think with the data centers, they're new, they're big, they're expensive. So I think the focus is better than it is in some other industries, just because of the high risk. Kind of the impact is absolutely immediate. If it goes down, it's a problem, and everybody knows about it really quickly. But so I think because of that, it's better. There's more focus. But Navid will probably either agree, hopefully, or disagree and tell me I'm wrong.
No, absolutely, Phil. Spot on. Yeah, I mean, in the boardroom, the costs of an outage go far beyond repair costs. That's not what they're interested in hearing, or even paying penalty, payouts, which could be quite costly. It's about reputational damage, and it's about customers who have zero tolerance, quite rightly, because of the nature of the infrastructure, and losing those customers to a competitor can be very expensive. Those are the subject matters that are primarily discussed at boardroom. How do we ensure that we don't hit these problems? What plans have been in place? Because as I touched on earlier, things do go wrong, and so when it goes wrong, have you got a proper protocol in place? If you have a proper protocol in place, you can reduce your damage. If you haven't, every day that you're losing is quite costly.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thing, because I think in this industry more than any other, the link between something that happens in a remote facility somewhere, a data center, ultimately the link between that and an end user or consumer is immediate. We know that we're operating on a call at the minute over the internet. That's ultimately running through a data center. Your banking transactions, social media, email, all these things are so interconnected and so dependent on these facilities. The reputational damage and end user consumer awareness of that is probably more so than any other industry. So it's unique in that fact, in my view. And that will get the attention, as the other guys have said, in the boardroom. That reputational damage is probably more prevalent in their minds than anything else, but caused by something that could be quite inconsequential in terms of cost. So if in the world of MRO, if your standard average order value is between £200 to £500 for a basket of goods, and something in that basket is designed to go and fix an asset and repair something, get something back online, and you're looking at downtime that isn't measured in the hours like it is in normal industry, it's measured in minutes, and could be costing, recent white paper that RS produced around data centers, it measures the cost between £7,000 and £10,000 a minute. Most of the customers in industry talk to us about downtime costs in hours. So for me, that distinction is really, really paramount when we're talking to customers in this space about how RS can create value for them in mitigating that and preventing that from happening in the first place. But yeah, ultimately that risk could be, what if a £20 part was causing £7,000 of downtime per minute? That the scales and the comparisons are crazy, and the consumer expectation is increasing all the time. We're not expecting our service to drop from these providers, and we're all using it every day. So yeah, it's a critical industry that we know we're involved in supporting.
Sure. So Richard, just to kind of follow on from that, do you think we're moving away from data centers and companies in general, actually across the industry, having a lowest unit cost mindset towards valuing other things when it comes to MRO?
I think it probably should do. I mean, it depends on who you're asking, I suppose. If you're asking someone in procurement or finance, they might have a different view to someone in operations and engineering. That's something we often see. But in the report that I mentioned before, the speed of delivery, responsiveness, and availability were all paramount in the end user's, the customer's mind when looking to source goods over and above price. But I imagine if you're the financial director of that facility, you'd want that price added back into that conversation quite quickly. But clearly, if your KPIs are geared by and measured in minutes and downtime, then you're going to want that part pretty damn quickly. So I think, there probably is an evolution and a maturity moving away from just putting cost in there, and it is ultimately about total cost. So it's everything from looking to source that item, then the procurement process to actually go and buy it, the lead time to get hold of it, and then the lag, if you like, of getting it back on the asset, on the piece of equipment that needed it. So we always encourage customers to think about total cost rather than unit cost, because there is a huge amount of time and effort that goes into, in terms of people's time. So engineers, procurement, finance, all going into sourcing goods, irrespective of the costs in that industry of downtime. You add that back in this instance in data centers, and the impact is exponential. So speed of delivery, responsiveness, and availability are the key things that our customers in this space are talking to us about.
What makes those conversations land with boards, finance teams, and operators in your experiences? How do you persuade that tricky finance person who's going to be like, we've got to be completely cost focused here? We
would take the view that you've got to have all of those interested parties, all those stakeholders in the room to create a collective decision and make some of what we do often is facilitating those internal conversations within our customer base to make sure that the finance person understands the pressure the engineer or the operations team are under, and procurement understand what finance are looking forward to. So it's facilitating a cross-party, multifunctional conversation, if you like, with those people to raise awareness of KPIs that are set forth with all best intentions and how they may impact and create some behaviours that aren't that value adding to other departments and other colleagues. And ultimately, how we look to create value, it's through that type of partnership. You can only do that if you're working with fewer vendors, if you like, and you've consolidated and working in a more mature space to a point. Then you try and extrapolate the value which they can create to alleviate some of those concerns across function.
I agree totally. It's about the overall value, and the value isn't in cost savings. The value is in all the preventative stuff and the added bits and pieces that Richard's just eloquently listed. And you can't have, it's about being strategically aligned as a business across all functions and all departments. You can't have procurement targeted with cost savings when you're trying to mitigate risk and everything elsewhere. So that total cost and total value.
And there was a backtracking a few years. The costing exercise was the main driver with some of these projects, and the finance team in all cases were always keen to return as much cost savings as possible. but cost savings at what cost? And they soon realized that saving 5%, 10%, even as much as 15% on a cheaper component was a counterproductive exercise. And so the mindsets were changed, in particular as we're moving towards facilities that really cannot be switched off. They really have to be on, and any downtime comes at a very high cost. So, getting the best price is no longer. I would say certainly the clients I speak to are more leaning towards less about transactional partners with partnerships with a supplier, more about a strategic partnership with the supplier and getting to know the supplier well, and creating that ecosystem that they can rely on. So the cost is secondary now. Up to obviously everything has to be budgeted, but it's no longer the main driver.
And also, I mean, Richard and I both mentioned innovation earlier. If you're hammering a supplier on costs, you're hardly likely to get innovation and creativity and commitment and forward thinking. It's you get what you pay for.
Okay, so continuing to talk about cost issues, I guess it's a question for all of you. How can operators and suppliers structure agreements around service levels, stocking, procurement, and inventory, so the procurement's actively protecting uptime rather than simply just managing spend? I mean, what does a good model look like when you're trying to balance resilience, cost, and responsiveness?
For me, if you want to start on that, I think it's about understanding the consumption of the products that you're looking to buy and not treating everything with the same approach. So something that you buy frequently or has a high value of spend against it in the year or forms part of your planned spend for that period should be treated very differently to something that you buy in an emergency basis and you just need to get hold of quickly. So focusing on that, on the way that products are consumed for a commercial lens is one thing, and then also how you create value around that through the services that suppliers can offer. So, we've talked about the fact you can't stock everything. So if you understand that you buy something frequently and regularly, having commercial agreements that are put in place, KPIs to measure that supplier for those core basket of goods, talking to that supplier about services they might be able to offer to support the procurement of those goods, things like VMI, vendor managed inventory, should be different to the things that you need to buy quickly in an emergency, often underpinned through quick availability or easy ordering processes in controlled ways, but in the same sort of ecosystem, if you like, of that supplier, so that you get great data and understand the nature of consumption. But having proactive conversations with that supplier around master service agreements, KPIs, SLAs, etc., that feel appropriate based on the nature of the product that you're buying, I think for me is a key starting point.
I agree with that completely. I think data, again, we've talked about data, and I think if you've got that data and you understand the consumption flow and the consumption rates and what's needed when, that kind of having that information and being able to sit down and plan forward, it's vital. So I think I agree with Richard.
Sure. Okay. So let's look into the future now. There's a question for you, Navid, really. Obviously, there's a big conversation going on about AI at the moment. And, AI-driven demand is definitely changing the pressure on data centers. So I wonder, what does that mean for infrastructure, power, cooling, maintenance, and day-to-day operational planning? As demand grows, does that make MRO even more important, or does it mean that it's kind of being eclipsed by other things and is left behind by the bigger build conversation?
I hear so many people talking about AI. AI is becoming a regular conversation, and quite rightly. Yeah, absolutely. AI is completely rewriting the rules of our industry. There's no doubt about that. Traditional data centers handle standard cloud computing. We all know about that. But in the case of AI, they require massive GPU compute clusters, and they pack a lot of power. They generate a lot of heat, and so you're up against a different ball game here. And The facilities have to be designed in a different way from the ground up. You can't just retrofit an existing facility that was built for cloud computing and convert it to AI. You can't. The structure is just not man enough to take the weight to start with. We're moving rapidly from standard air cooled. We all know that to liquid cooled for the obvious reasons, because air isn't sufficient enough to take care of the higher operating temperatures. And also, if I go back a few years, in the past, data centers had scheduled quiet periods where engineers could go in and carry out service work.
Mm-hmm.
You can no longer just shut down parts of the data center facility to carry out lengthy work, and so work has to be done on the fly. What does that mean? It means that the maintenance windows are shrinking dramatically. We have to service high stress equipment on the fly, and all that goes towards raising operational stakes. So it's not just so while it's moving and it's creating a lot of challenges, we have to also put in place revised framework to take care of those issues are going to be coming our way. When legacy servers go down, it's an inconvenience. When an AI training cluster goes down, you're talking about a multi-million-pound training run. Basically, it can cost a lot of money. And so from a balance, I guess, from the investor's perspective and looking at their balance sheet as they do, a failure in an AI data center is a major financial event. That's kind of how they're seeing it. And I think those are some of the reasons why a developer who is looking at building an AI facility for the purpose of AI training, for example, so high density racks, lots to think about, liquid cooled facilities. They've got to really think about who they're going to be partnering with, who's going to be delivering that facility that's going to be operating the most efficient way. And that's where the due diligence processes are getting longer in terms of qualifying a partner to go in and cater for these challenges. The other area that a lot of people don't seem to touch on, but it's absolutely key to efficient operation of a data center, is BMS and EPMS. So on the digital infrastructure side, while you've got many of the facets that drop under the digital infrastructure framework, one of those facets is BMS and EPMS. You need specialist contractors that really understand how to control the environment within the data center, how to monitor power usage, etc. So bringing all those people together who are up to speed with today's AI data center design, it's a challenge on its own, not least because of the skill shortages out there. And so these are some of the challenges in the industry that I think we need to step back and do something about.
I mean, so clearly it sounds like MRO becomes even more important then.
It does. It really is data centers are not what they used to be years ago, and they're moving at a fast pace. They're not getting simpler, they're getting more complex. And with that complexity, things are moving at a fast pace. And if you don't have your framework in place and you're just shooting in the dark, it's a risky business to be in. And those are the key points that clients will look for before they even invest in a developer these days.
Right, so we're coming to the end of our discussion. I've got one more question, which is for all three of you. And what I really want to know is, what is the single biggest thing that's going to make data center facilities more resilient from day one? So if there's a change the industry needs to make, is it going to be about earlier MRO planning? Or is it better procurement maturity, stronger supplier partnerships, or better internal ownership of operational risk? And I bet you're all going to say probably all of the above, but maybe think about maybe one or two things you would most want to emphasize.
Started off talking about relationships, And I'll finish by talking about relationships. And I think it's relationships from it's a whole business thing. It's not just a procurement thing, but it kind of sits with procurement to have brilliant relationships with their suppliers, with key suppliers that we've described in detail through this conversation, but also internal customers. Our first question was around kind of like how things fall between the gaps between the kind of the engineers and the operators and supply. It's having those really, really good joined up relationships with all parties. So, and that goes up as well because it goes to the boardroom. It's about the understanding, the increased understanding of the importance of MRO within the whole kind of team and where it sits in its importance within business. And again, we've eloquently described some of the things that can go wrong and the impacts that it can have. So it's about those relationships. It's not just about studying spreadsheets and signing things up. It's about understanding everybody's concerns, everybody's priorities, and being able to manage those relationships and work as a really, really effective team.
I would say it starts with the customer understanding their criticality of products they've got in their facility. Have they done a analysis of that? Have they understood where the single points of failure are, and the sorts of products that they need their supply chain to support them with ultimately? Then allowing that criticality to inform their supply chain strategy, working with suppliers with broad capability that can create value in different ways and engage with OEMs to bring innovation to the fore. And then finally, I suppose, looking at aggregating that data, but importantly, not just providing data, but valuable insight from that data to inform the future strategy and how it develops long term. Naveed's talk about the pace of change. That's going to mean that data, that insight is important to understand where you are now. Because ultimately, if you're changing at a rapid pace, you don't really understand where you're starting from. You're just being ripped along with the tide rather than working from a coherent plan. So, for me, having those relationships that Phil's talked about with suppliers and in their supply chain is hugely important. Having a plan that backs that up and understands what that supplier needs to do to support and manage the criticality and the risk that comes with that, I think is equally important.
I'm not sure if I can add any more value. I think Richard and Phil covered it very well. I would say taking a holistic approach to procurement, engineering, and operations will go a long, long way from the early stages of the project. I think that would get you on the right path from the very early stages and it does ensure that you're not operating amongst multiple silos, which just create nothing but complexity. And of course, cost that comes with it. I think if the processes can be revisited at the early stages, there's always room for fine-tuning, but also getting multiple parties on a site to work together efficiently. And that level of collaboration will go a long, long way in successful delivery of any type of data center. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be AI data centers. The only difference with AI is it does put more pressure on the delivery partners and there's more risk to be had. So you absolutely need to be on the ball, or it can be very costly for every month that you're late in handing over.
Brilliant. Well, that brings us to the end of today's discussion. Big thank you to Naveed, Phil and Richard for sharing their perspectives and take us through how data centers move from build to live operation and looking at the support they need once they're up and running. I think, the thing that strikes me is, it's very clear that MRO is not just a back-end consideration. It's a really critical part of ensuring resilience, protecting uptime, and making better procurement decisions from day one. And, as we see this ongoing demand for data centers, it's particularly fueled by the rise of AI, and all the variables that bring, the pressure on getting this right is only going to increase. Thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to continuing the conversation in the future.